Hey guys, welcome back to the With Joe EB podcast Harry Potter series. I'm trying a different spot today. You might get some chirping in the background, so forgive me for that. I just want to, give this a shot, and discuss I want to discuss immortality, the concept of immortality, and how it's subtly interwoven into our everyday lives, and then painted really transparently and powerfully and simply in the Harry Potter series. There's just so many layers to that storyline over the 7 books and films, which is obviously why I'm doing the series in the first place. In the previous episodes, we went over backstories of Voldemort, Dumbledore, Harry. Now I want to dive into some of the things that interweave with those big characters. Now, the idea that immortality, the quest for immortality, is subtly woven into everyday life, might be a challenging idea to grasp at first. I think about it in terms of, firstly, anything you get attached to, right? So, anything, for example, personally, I've started, talked about on the podcast, a real estate business in the past, things like this podcast. We're starting a comedy channel at the moment, which is a new challenge. So there's lots of these sorts of things that go on. And sometimes you start something like that with a lot of excitement, with a lot of maybe even hope. Maybe it's just for fun, but you often bring expectation into things, right? I think it's pretty relatable in life, whether it was at school, whether it's at university, whether it's at work, whether it's in relationships. And then suddenly you find yourself caught to things and not wanting them to fall over, right? So even though, we did a whole series on the myth of failure, even though that whole perspective on how we're always gaining, even when we lose, there's some sort of value that we've been given, upside, and the slingshot principle, things like that we talk about on the podcast before. Despite all that, when we do get attached to things, when we get emotional about them, when we get very personally invested in them, when we identify with them, right, we start to treat things like a survival game that are in no way a survival game, but things start to feel life or death. I've talked to people before, for example, who are having a very bad experience in their workplace, right? They find things quite toxic, and there's this feeling, so I felt this before with many things I've worked on, there's a feeling that it's your only shot, that it's make or break, right? And it doesn't matter, the people I talk to are normally in their early 20s, I'm still in my 20s, such a long life theoretically ahead, and yet something you work on at such a young age can feel like a life, feel like your only shot, your last shot, your one true shot. You fear that your reputation will suffer, that your confidence will suffer, that you won't have the momentum you were after. And sometimes you feel that way in relationships. Sometimes you feel like in certain, I think more romantic, but maybe friendships, sometimes you feel like it's your only shot. Like you need to make this one work at any cost. I feel like these are some of the thoughts, right, and ideas that come to you, right? Now, what's this got to do with immortality? What's this got to do with Harry Potter? So you might already have seen one of the links, right? This idea that we start to cling to things like their life or death. Look at any reaction you think of in the world as trivial. Road rage. Right, I remember the angry parents emailing about their sons not being in the right soccer team or debating team, not getting into the top team, and getting really angry about that, writing an email. There's all these things that we love, and it's a basis for it's the root of a lot of comedy in life, of course, and a lot of our entertainment. But why do we overreact so much and so often? And even a lot of, talking about smart, really intelligent people doing this stuff. Why does this happen so often? And my theory is that, again, we bring survival into things because we identify with them. It's a very ego-based thing, and when we identify with them, we now attach our survival to them. So this is why the real state of the true liberating freedom so often comes from not being tied down by anything, not being attached to anything. So in certain religions and stuff. That's why sometimes there's an emphasis on going without. You know, it's not that the things actually hurt you. It's that, well, why don't you just avoid them? The idea is by abstaining. Why don't you just avoid them? That way, you can't be attached to and seduced by them and weighed down by them. You don't identify with them. If you're not rich, it's hard to identify with the things you've gotten by being rich. But it doesn't really work, because what you renounce, what you try to avoid for its own sake, you chain yourself to it with invisible chains, which is funny. It's an imprisonment via denial. It's the opposite. It's just the reverse, but you're still doing the same thing. So in Harry Potter, we've talked about Dumbledore versus Voldemort. And the thing with those two characters is they both are pursuing immortality, but only one of them is consciously doing it. The other is letting it happen. Right? They both engage in what in many religions we'd call the struggle for eternal life. But again, one of them is much more dedicated about it than the other. They both are finding ways to extend the influence of their existence, but again, they have the ways of doing it couldn't be more contrasting. So be patient with me down this little rabbit hole, and then we'll link it all together. So Voldemort is very deliberately after physical immortality. He wants his body to live forever. And with a spiritual lens on this, the kind of conventional spiritual teaching is, of course, you're not really your body. You know, your body's a vessel. You are no more your body than you are your car. Your car is a vehicle that you drive around in. Yes, you get to hone a bit of a sense for it. Sometimes you're able to reverse or park without looking completely everywhere. You just get a sense for where the body of the car is by extension of yourself. But it is not you. You know, the car can crash, and you'd be very annoyed or upset. You might get hurt as a bit of a recoil, but you are not the car. You can go on, right? And so this is probably a good metaphor for the body that we live in. You know, the consciousness thing, or the voice thing, whatever you want to call it, whatever name doesn't eke you out too much. Whatever voice is in here, which is not even your brain, right? It's not even the mind. It's something deeper than that. All right, so that goes on. But Voldemort has already made the first mistake, that he wants because his body is the container for his consciousness, he's anxious about losing it. So he's pursuing immortality, and thus he's incredibly afraid of death. Right? So you see that especially in the 7th book. Anytime he's for example, figures out, spoiler alert, right, for this series. Anytime he figures out that Harry's getting close to the Horcruxes, he is in a panic. He gets white hot with rage. So you see his reaction. And so as a result, he's gone through the most painful, soul-reducing, well, literally he splits his soul into 7 pieces. And the spiritual idea I sit with at the moment is that what you are, the voice in your head, that is you are a soul. Your little consciousness, or your little awareness of your existence, that entity that can do all that. That is what the word soul refers to. So credit Michael Singer for framing it that way. It just makes a lot of bloody sense to me. And so Voldemort is anxious, so he pursues physical mortality. And obviously you see that in the Philosopher's Stone, and then you see that with the Horcruxes. And he'll do it at any cost, because to him that is the ultimate, that is the base. If not his physical existence, then what else? Dumbledore, by contrast, well, could he be more contrasting? So Dumbledore doesn't walk around with the fear of death, right? In the first book, there's that quote, Harry, to the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure. Good friend Gilly, who sometimes is like a real-life Dumbledore, or the constant student Dumbledore, he said to me the other day, Joe, I'm starting to see death less and less as an end, and much more of just a transition, a turning of pages, really. That's all it is. If it is that, it's just nothing to be feared. It's a liberating thought. And that's the understanding that Dumbledore walks with when he's faced with his mortality. You don't even get which is the sixth book, or revealed in the seventh book, there's no anxiousness, right? There's nothing defensive about his reaction. It's totally peaceful and welcoming. He's not alarmed by it, so he's not very attached to his own life. Now, isn't that fascinating? And how does Dumbledore go about immortality? He doesn't really think it that way. But there's that wonderful line in the books: "Help will always be given to those at Hogwarts who ask for it." I may have slightly said it wrong, but you probably understand the gist. And, you see that a bit more directly at times. Like, you see his Phoenix Forks come to Harry's aid, in several of the books. Like, I think the fifth one, maybe in the seventh at some point, brings the Sorting Hat again to Neville, can't remember. And then the second one, especially it's the first time, because Dumbledore's taken away, but Fawkes is still there. And so Dumbledore's influence, right, lives on. And so it's not the sort of, if I said, I can help you get immortality, you would say, oh wow, great, do you have a health serum or something? And I'd say, no, we can live authentically now, and then the impact of your life, leaves this indelible trace. It ripples silently and anonymously through the generations. You'd be like, well, that's not really the immortality I'm looking for, Joe, but thanks for trying. And so we just don't accept it. And the idea of the real idea of an eternal life being the thing that you enjoy now, right? Like right now. A difficult idea to grasp. That there's just this joy. Dumbledore doesn't strike you at all as a very unhappy character, I think, in the books and films. So their approaches couldn't be more contrasting. And there's this wonderful Anthony DeMello quote I saw the other day. It's if you fear death, you are not able to live now. And that very much is Voldemort, right? And it's very much anyone in their everyday life. So it's very clear, and we talked about this in previous episodes, we talked about why, because Voldemort never really knew love growing up. You understand why he can't really conceive of love. So he doesn't actually have a concept for it. I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with someone where they didn't have even a concept for what you were talking about. It's a very different type of conversation. For example, if no one had ever heard of religion, if no one had ever heard of business, right? If they came from a remote island, and you're trying to explain this concept that of business, that people, go into a little box usually together, and they sit in little cubicles, and they plug away at this little magic electronic box, and they're sending each other messages. And they're arranging there's money that goes into this invisible, this bank account, and then from that bank account, if you start explaining a concept like that, people who'd never grown up in, say, the West or a quote-unquote civilized society, it's hard to digest, right? So that's what Voldemort doesn't have a concept for love. And so what he's left with when he looks at the world is just his power. This pursuit of power. And that's the only terms on which he can really pursue immortality. He needs to know that he's going to last. He needs certainty. So certainty is always one of these things that injects itself when, Voldemort's diversified. He's done what the sage investors do, so-called sage investors. Not Warren Buffett, funnily enough. He's diversified himself, right? 7 Horcruxes. He's split his bets. And it's because he wants to retain power. And obviously you see that he never has enough. And obviously you see that he's never done. And that he has to, once he's got power, he has to constantly defend it. And that's just exhausting to him, right? He's always just on the back pedal. Like, you don't see him feet up on a beach enjoying it. He's just very angry at the world, and he cannot stop. Angry at the world only because he's angry at himself. He just can't accept himself. He can't accept that he's got muggle blood in him. And so the result of that, because he won't look inward, the result of that is he's looking for power. There's no bigger drug to him, right? And power and immortality and influence and everything being followed. And so the only currency he can cultivate is power, right? And so there's that idea that the only people, who are the two main people that follow Voldemort, revealed in the sixth book? People who are weak, so that's like the Wormtails, right? The Peter Pettigrews, who he loves James and Remus and all that, and Sirius, while they're powerful, and then when someone more powerful comes along, he's loyal to power, so he goes with the power. So you got those people, and then you got the super ambitious, right? The kind of Lucius Malfoys, for example. So that's the only people that follow Voldemort. And that's true of the world, right? That's true of the world. We'll unpack that in a bit. But you can start thinking about your own experiences, where it's the weak and the equally ambitious, the equally hungry, that are following along those who are pursuing power. And what a powerful idea. Pardon the pun. The problem with that approach and that way to immortality, right? Because it's built on all these followers and it's built on fear, right? People are afraid to speak out. They're afraid to step out against Voldemort. So it's all built on fear. But obviously, in the end, people who follow power will follow power when it shifts away from you, when it looks like it's not going to stick with you as well. And you've seen that playing out millions of times in politics over the years. You've seen it play out time and time again in politics. Big regimes and, Genghis Khan's dynasty eventually fell. And you see it in the movies, you see it in Game of Thrones is a very beautiful depiction of power struggles and how as soon as it looks like the Tywin Lannister, for example, character in Game of Thrones, as soon as it looks like the Mad King is maybe not the best bet, loyalty shifts the other way. Whereas loyalty that's built on the back of love, Dumbledore's loyalty is impregnable, right? This is a funny time to use a business word, but it's defensible. You know what I mean? It's not this blind loyalty. You might argue that a lot of Voldemort's followers love him, but it's not really that. If you want to use the word love, I think it's a bit offensive to the word love, but you'd probably bring up someone like Bellatrix Lestrange, who, unlike Snape and Malfoy and Wormtail, she never wavers, right? But if you look at the way she follows Voldemort, it's this manic, cult-like attachment, right? There's no doubt. She reminds me a bit of like the controversial territory here, but the religious extremist, right? Who knows all the words, is unfaultingly loyal in one sense to their faith, but doesn't actually embody it, doesn't actually understand it, right? It's just attached to it, needs it. It's so desperate and clinging. And what I think often goes over a lot of people's heads who pursue life on a level of attachment, right? So there's a neediness for things like achievements, other people, validation, social media, money, big houses, could be anything, being followed, anything like that. That neediness brings blindness. It creates huge blind spots. It blurs perspective. It dilutes your actual potential. And it makes it difficult to survive in the long term. Because eventually you've built it. It's like building the Tower of Pisa on a faulty foundation. It just doesn't really last. So that's the Bellatrix Lestrange character for me. Meanwhile, over in Camp Dumbledore, Harry's not this unwavering, Dumbledore cult-like follower. He has a lot of doubt, and that's what the seventh book is good at doing. It shows his doubt. You see it all the way through the books. He's constantly doubting. And there's this quote a teacher said to me on a retreat many years ago. Without doubt, there's no faith. Because it's just blindness. Which is why I think free will is a complex idea, and we could go into that another time. Which is why free will is essential. If there's a godlike thing, if you believe in that, You might just call it the universe or any of these other concepts. Are very interchangeable for me right now. Um, and you see this in Dumbledore. He allows a lot of doubt. So you start to see how this all links. Yet Dumbledore has this he's obtained this immortality, right? His influence really goes on. There's his memory, his influence, his inspiration, the values he brought across, and the mark he left. But he's also not looking to carve a legacy. Right? And legacy is a very interesting word we could talk about here. So, Dumbledore love. Voldemort, to me, is the pure expression of ego. He's just a character that expresses ego, or what in Christianity would call the devil. To me, that is what, narcissism, the unhealthy need to believe in your own importance. Narcissism, the devil in Christianity, Voldemort are all interchangeable concepts. To me, they're all just symbols for narcissism. Right? And you can see why. The temptation, the idea of temptation, you get that, the idea of power. And so let's talk about power. What's power? There's a lot of people who want money, right? They want money in this life. I'm talking now, not in the Harry Potter books, but you and I in our everyday, in the world we know. Let's take money, for example. A lot of people who want money. Now, those people who want money, they don't think they're going to live forever. Right? Yeah, there's breakthroughs in health and all this stuff and longevity research, all that, but they don't think they're going to live forever, but they want money. And they want money, but also sometimes you get these people who desperate for money and they want to spend it, they want to buy all the stuff, right? And that's the Dubai bling kind of form. But there's some people who don't spend it, right? There's some people who are desperate for money, but they don't flash it, they don't spend it all the time. They're not wearing designer clothes necessarily. They're not necessarily buying expensive cars. And so you might think that those people are genuine. Maybe they are. This is not a witch hunt on those people. We love and seek to understand and learn from them. But if you look at money not just as a tool for buying things, but a measure of power, you start to get a very different insight into who people are. Right? Because it's very different to say, I want power for power's sake. I want to be big for big's sake. I want to be known for the sake of being known. But we dilute it into what we think are socially acceptable things. And we pass them off as normal in society. Alright? So this is what we do. So power, you could read power into someone who wants to have a big following, someone who wants to be, someone who wants the approval of lots of other people, someone who wants a position of authority, someone who wants to be head of the committees, Because the thing about power games is we don't normally all want to be prime minister or president of the world or the Academy Award winner. When we are fooled by the ego, by temptation, into a path that leads to turning out like Voldemort, which is not a good life, right? You get to have a lot, but do you find yourself being jealous of Voldemort? When you get conned into that, it's basically one way or another of having power. And you first see it first as wanting to have control, right? Control is the first seed. So when people are very controlling, in obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, which is a thing we always joke about with people we know who are particular high-strung, need things to be their way. People who are controlling, boss at work. You notice these are all subtle games representing a bigger game that's going on, of the desire to have power over the environment, other people, right? And often innocuous where you see them, as far as you see them. But they might be, the root of it might come, or normally always comes from something deeper and darker, if it's fed. Not everyone here is a walking psychopath, right? Just because they have controlling behaviours. We all have controlling behaviours, for look's sake. But you see how Dumbledore's not like that. Dumbledore's the opposite, because love is not like that. Love is not controlling. Love is not demanding. Again, Dumbledore, Voldemort, the dichotomy couldn't be clearer. These are the two main ways of approaching every situation in life and life itself. And this is what Harry's journey is the toing and froing, but he's got similarities, especially physical similarities to Voldemort, and he's got pieces of him in him. So which path is he going to go down? And so you got, that's obviously why I think the story resonates so much. This is why, to me, this is a Bible. These books are a Bible, and they're a religious text if you want them to be. They're a spiritual text, but it's buried within a children's story, a children's books. You see why I'm raving and making so many episodes about this. Incredibly powerful stuff. And there's big questions in there, right? There's very big questions in there. So power in all its forms. And the idea I was talking about at the start, this linking, right? We turn things into this survival game, and we cling. I said this a few times before, but the way we live en masse, on average, in general, only makes sense if you take away the reality that we're going to die. If you remove that reality that we're going to die, then the way we live makes sense. But if you look at it the way it is now, the way we live doesn't really make much sense. We're constantly looking for what we don't have and not valuing what we do have. When it could all go at any moment. And what do? We so often are trying to, we try to avoid the signs of our aging, of our death, like having, I don't want to judge any of these things, but if it's things like Botox, if it's things like, some people get operations done to their noses just purely for aesthetic reasons. They don't have a deviated septum. I'm talking about purely for aesthetic reasons. What do? They have their wrinkles pulled or whatever it is. I don't judge any of these things. I mean, none of them is harmful at all, right? Like, directly. Maybe it feeds into trends that are not of the healthiest and purest of form of things we could do to ourselves, but and make it seem more normal and okay. But apart from that, there's no real, no one's hurting anyone with these things as far as I'm aware. But what does it represent? Why do we do this? We're going to age. And so often people look better that don't get this sort of work done. But that's just the physical example, right? Why does a midlife crisis manifest in often the stereotype of buying the sports car and, participating in the young fads? We are subtly in our mind, or maybe somewhere deeper, we are subtly looking for this immortality. We're looking for the eternal life idea that's kind of put forward in religions, it seems, in other forms. This is not an attempt to convince you of any religious dogma or any particular belief system. I'm obviously influenced by those systems, the way I grew up, but I'm just looking at, they're there for a reason. They're not purely random stories that have been created if you're a skeptic on, the religious belief systems that are out there. I think they're there. They resonate so much for a reason. They're a big part of, maybe it's our psychology, maybe it's our entire spiritual being. They seem to resonate with desires or questions we have there. I mean, children from a young age are curious about where babies come from. It's a cliche. It happens so consistently. And that, to me, is them pulling at the thread of the question of existence and where we come from, and therefore what is life? What is this life thing I've been given? It's a very natural question. What is the meaning of life is the biggest cliche question. And it's there why? It's there because it's the reality. And yet, we're always looking for this deluded game of immortality. It's always playing on our minds. And the power of human denial is so extreme. If you think about someone who doesn't look good in what they're wearing, or wants to get away with walks around with some stupid outfit that they think looks good because they want it to look good. You know, we're so sold on the ideas we have in our head of how things can be. And, you know, really a lot of the things we pursue, I think a lot of the things you can pursue through the vehicle of business, which can be a tool to do great things, but how there's this desire, right, to build this legacy so often, this thing that you'll be known for, you'll be remembered for. You know, the concept of a legacy might seem innocuous, but to me it's again feeding into this immortality desire, right? This fear of death. The immortality desire comes from a fear of death, and ignorance towards the reality of death, right? Because if it's an end, and it's an end, and we're afraid of that, then what are we going to do? We seek whatever that's the desperation we have. We're so wired for this eternal life thing. We accept whatever deluded understanding we form towards it, and we try and pursue that, to be known, to make sure our kids remember us, and we leave them something glorious so they feel indebted to us, so they remember us, just so there's any reason, right, for us to be remembered, still talked about, worshipped. It's just fascinating, right? It is fascinating how you can see this in everything. You can see this in everything. I think it's why we get so obsessed with our material survival, the quality of our material survival, rather than our deeper experience of life. The deeper experience requires us to confront questions of which answers we're afraid of, because it's this confrontation that we're going to die, because we assume that us dying is something to be feared. Voldemort. But it's probably not true. It's probably not true at all. Right? So I think that things like legacy, we have all these things like legacy, things like glory, things like our net worth and what we leave behind. You see that Dumbledore, I think, has a legacy, for example, but he doesn't look for it. Right? He doesn't look for it. It just ensues. You know, one of my favorite words, ensue. That we don't get confused between what's the result of doing good, and we don't make that the outcome we're pining for. It's a very powerful difference. And why I think is often lost on us when we start down the wrong path is that the wrong path is kind of pursued to its extreme, is a kind of Voldemort trajectory. That pursuing power for it in whatever form and deluding ourselves about it because we're trying to fill a hole, kind of an existential hole, but we've so hidden that from ourselves because we've just built all these foundations of, it's like Inception, we've built this dream on top of a dream on top of a dream so we don't have to wake up to the core one. And then we go about pursuing all these things in the world based totally in unreality. So we do the most insensitive things while we're playing these games to other people and ourselves. We continue and often extend the suffering and often not learning a great deal. And in the end, the more we cling to it, the more we corrupt ourselves like Voldemort. And you see that Voldemort's just this pitiful thing by the end of the Harry Potter series. Whereas you look at Dumbledore, who just allows age and wisdom to take their course, and then, you know, he's very content and he leaves behind, you know, and that's the path of love. And he still has great things. He's got great people. He's got a great position, a great job. He's very talented. So all that comes, but pursuing the way of love. And that's the real eternal life, that when you feel that course through you, you don't want anything else, and you don't care if you die and you live in an eternal darkness after. So, yeah, that I think was my takeaways. So we'll keep going with this idea and the powerful forces of how the ego and narcissism and the consequences of what you do in life are pursued in Harry Potter in the next episode. As a reminder, there'll always be links Any further links in the description, like the Dorman newsletter for any updates from my world, or Constant Student, which is normally just a chance to meet other people who are interested in asking these sorts of questions and living on this kind of level, and just having a support community. And so that is totally free at the moment and the foreseeable future, literally no cost involved. So if you're interested in checking what that is, the community of lifelong learners, you can check that out in the description. Thank you. See you in the next episode. Remember that the best way to open 1,000 doors for you is to concentrate on opening doors for others.